In our first reading, the second reading, Paul talks about wisdom, and he contrasts God's wisdom to mere human wisdom. And I want us in a minute to look at something in the gospel. It's a small little detail that could suggest to us something about Jesus' wisdom and his compassion toward us, even when in righteous anger he may need to correct us or discipline us. Now, Jesus, in his wisdom, today in the gospel, shows us, among other things, that there were some problems, actually, with the high priests and these merchants wanting an unjust amount of money. Because one of the problems with what was going on that made Jesus so angry was that by selling the sheep and the oxen and the doves and doing the money exchange, the people who were doing that were charging unfair high prices to the worshipers coming to the temple. And so there was injustice, first of all, and oppression, particularly of the poor, devout Jewish people who came to the temple. What was going on, in case you haven't heard this or read this or studied this, is that for Passover, when Jews, not just from Israel, but from other countries as well, would travel to Israel and to Jerusalem, they had to take part in the sacrifices and contribute to the temple. And so they would replicate or imitate the first Passover, in which we all know an unblemished lamb was slain, and the blood was placed on the doorpost to protect the Jews from the avenging angel. So they had to take part in a symbolic representation of that by either bringing a sheep with them that was perfect and unblemished, or buying it there. And then there were other sacrifices and contributions that involved beef, and so the oxen. But if they were too poor to afford either one of those, people could buy doves, which were less expensive and were an acceptable substitute. The money changers were there because the contributions that they made to the temple, and then also buying these goods for the sacrifices, they had to do it in Jewish currency. So if they were Jewish from another country and they had their own country's currency, they had to exchange it. And if they were foreigners, Gentiles, people who were not Jewish but were coming to the temple because they felt an attraction to the Jewish faith and to God as understood by the Jewish people, they too had to exchange their other country's currency for Jewish currency. And they would have suffered from a high, unfair exchange rate. And then the oxen and sheep and the doves would have been sold for way inflated, unfair prices. So that's one of the reasons that Jesus was upset and angry, because of the injustice of this system that was exploiting people's needs to buy these things and to exchange their money, and doing it at unfair high prices. And it seems, sad to say, that some of the high priests of the temple were conniving with these sellers, and they would take their cut out of the profits from this unjustly high prices. So that's another thing that would have Jesus angry in a righteous and proper way. Finally, where they were doing this, from what people can tell studying the layout and documents of the temple of the time, all this selling and money exchanging, so you can imagine with the oxen and the sheep and all the noise that animals make and the doves cooing in their cages and all that kind of stuff, was being done in a part of the temple called the court of the Gentiles. And it was officially and spiritually, you might say, inside the building of the temple, but it was people who were not Jewish. That was as far as they could go. So if they felt like they wanted to take part in the Jewish faith but did not become Jewish, if they wanted to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, then they could come and they could take part, but they were limited in how far they could go into the building. So here they were, where they wanted to pray and worship, and there's all these sheep and oxen and probably loud bartering over the prices and arguments over the exchange rate and all this confusion, so it would hurt their ability to pray. The very people that the Israelites were called to bless by God to bring them closer to God, when they would come to the temple, they'd be hindered from praying well because of all the falderall and marketplace stuff going on. So those are all those reasons then that Jesus was righteously and properly angry about what was going on. And yet in his anger, there's a very interesting little detail, which I acknowledge I only saw after all these years of hearing and reading this gospel. Another sermon by another pastor that I read about this gospel made a parenthetical remark. Really, it wasn't the main focus of his preaching, but he made one remark about one little detail in his story that caught my attention, and I've been thinking about it ever since. And I want to call your attention to it, and it's such a small text-based detail. I think you would be well off if you would take the missal and read along with me rather than just listen to me talking about it. So I want to encourage everybody to grab a missal, and it's on page 78, today's gospel. Because even with me, reading this guy talking about it didn't have as much impact as when I actually then read the gospel myself and saw the words myself physically. So I want you to read along with me. It's in the second sentence of the gospel passage. Jesus found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as the money changers seated there. And then when he takes on his forceful and aggressive anger to cleanse the temple and to set this thing right, he makes a whip out of cords, and he drives them all out of the temple area. And that's what it says, with the sheep and the oxen. So what's missing?